We've got a really exciting discussion. Public asset inventory has been an issue that was maybe even unheard of on the kind of governance sphere not too long ago. And technology is kind of making it possible to really do some new innovative ways of looking at public assets. And so we've got a really excellent group for you today. We have Shaleane Gee, who's a senior vice president at the Community Regional Development Program at Zions Bank. We have Nicholas Fritz, who's the Director of Impact Investing at Intermountain Healthcare, Jonathan Ward, a Senior Vice President at Zions Bank Public Finance, Dayon Eskich, a Senior Research Analyst at Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute, and Max Backlund, who's a Senior Research Associate at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. So really excited to have everybody today. Just want to provide a brief introduction on this issue. Some of you may have heard it at our annual convention 2 years ago. Shaleane and Joe Minicozy presented on it. We've had both of them present to our board as well. It's an issue that I think there's increasing attention paid to. At the legislative level, the Commission on Housing Affordability has been discussing this in the past few months. So I'm sure that you'll be hearing more and more about it in the future. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Shaleane.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad to be joining you today or in the future if you're watching this later. As mentioned, this is a continuation of a conversation that we've been having together as a community in Utah and with the support and help of the League for a couple of years now, including at the convention last year, where Joe gave the keynote, and we'll revisit some of that information. Joe Minicozy from Urban 3 gave the keynote, and we'll revisit some of that information. And it's also a continuation of conversations that have been bubbling up organically across the state about how to think about public real estate and how we make best use of it for public good. And as mentioned too, it's also a continuation of this year's convention, and we were intending to present it then, but I was trying to do that from California, where I got caught in some apocalyptic scenarios and couldn't connect. So I'm happy to be with you today. What I'm going to do is run through a slide presentation, and I'm going to do it really quickly. There's a lot of information here on the slides, and it gets a bit wonky, but we're going to hit it at a high level, and then you'll have it after the fact, and we can always revisit some of the slides once we get through them and we start the discussion. So if you'll bear with me, we'll get started and kind of go through it. What we want to do today is share information with you about the potential of public asset development in Utah, and then also share with you what some of the state's anchor organizations across the state representing banking, healthcare, philanthropy, and education and public policy work are doing to work with public landowners to identify and help unlock the value of real estate assets. We also want to take some time to demonstrate what we think is the really strong correlation that needs to be recognized and maximized between public asset development and healthy communities and how we think about that. And then our third objective today is we want to hear from you. As mentioned, this is an ongoing conversation, and we need you to help us get this right for how we're working with you and working with local communities. So we're going to cover a couple of things today, just definitions and scope of what we're talking about with public asset development, because we get a lot of questions on that. The what, the how, and the why in the big picture. Talk about some priority frameworks that we're thinking about for public asset development in Utah in particular. Some partnership structures that we want to explore, some partnership resources we're thinking about, some of the demonstration projects and case studies that we've put together over the last year and that we'll be working to document during the coming year. And then talk with you a little bit about how we're developing public policy recommendations and guiding principles for all of us in this kind of work. So a couple of definitions and scopes. Again, this is foundational information we've thought about before, but just to remind ourselves, we're talking about publicly owned real estate. So land, buildings, and other assets owned by all types of entities. We're talking not just about cities, but about state governments, counties, transportation authorities, our utilities, land banks where we have them, housing authorities, schools, any public landowner. Public asset development, we mean the professional practice of identifying, assessing, and managing assets for best public use. both individual assets as well as overall asset portfolios. So your entire real estate asset portfolio. And then we're including all kinds of strategies for that development. Selling, but we want to put a caveat on that, leasing, other types of transactions, maintaining, rehabilitating, commercially developing, a bunch of things that we'll go over. And then we're thinking of the benefits in a couple of really key ways. As I mentioned, we really want to promote the idea that smart public asset management involves doing more than just identifying what surplus assets can be sold. We're thinking about smart asset development as involving a range of things that can generate new sources of public revenue and new services and land uses that benefit your communities. Just a quick reminder of where this kind of thought comes from. As Carson mentioned, it's kind of a new concept in government world. Some of the thought about this is recognizing that public real estate assets are the largest wealth segment in the world globally. And we've found that that translates down to national, state, and local levels as well. And I know we've got a lot of presentations in the past about that. So we're looking at a significant capacity here, and we'll touch on that in a minute, what it means locally. We also know that in the United States, most governments and public entities don't know what they own comprehensively. There's various reasons for that. But if you're in a situation where you do not have a comprehensive list of all the real estate assets that you own, or have a comprehensive strategy for how to manage them or think about them, you are not alone. In fact, you're in the significant majority. So here you can see we know that cities often know what they owe and what they need to pay for, but they don't often know what they own and how they can use what they own to help pay for it. Over the past couple of years in Utah, we've had a bunch of presentations and discussions about how to unlock this public wealth. There's 4 basic steps that are recommended in the national kind of expertise literature. Really simply, they are mapping and valuing assets, a hard job if you don't have current technology. But since we have that, it's becoming easier, but it's still a hard job. Setting up different policies and management structures, maximizing your portfolio, and then driving community benefit, economic development, and social services. I put a star here. I want to just highlight that. One of the things that we're really interested here is stewarding policy, legislative, accounting, and public stakeholder concerns with real care and transparency. And we'll talk about what the Gardner Policy Institute is going to help us do in that regard, because we are talking about making revenue on publicly owned land and doing that in a way that benefits both public and private partners in the mix. So we want to be really careful. We get this question a lot, why not just sell the land? Here's some reminders from Urban 3, again, who gave the keynote last year. This is a big picture answer. They reference this project in Boston, the old city jail, old version, new version. The city sold that facility and lost the opportunity to realize this kind of benefit. Pretty significant. Small projects though too. Here's another Urban 3 reminder. This is a very small building on a very small parcel. Just a reminder of what potential is there, no matter what type of asset you're looking at, how big or small. And this one from Urban 3, also really significant for what we're talking about across the state in all kinds of different communities between different types of developments, including on land that you own. So where are we in Utah? We're taking a really comprehensive, careful, and collaborative approach. The national literature and experts don't always recognize the real difficulties on the ground in getting some of these things conceptualized and started. And so we're trying to do that in a responsible way. We're mapping and valuing assets and supporting that work across the state. We'll talk about that in a second. We are identifying and supporting demonstration projects, and we'll talk about those too in brief. And we needed those to help us get beyond the theoretical, to really get down to the nitty-gritty on some of the details with some of these potential projects, to vet some of the obstacles, legal, financial, community perception, all kinds of things, and then to develop some policy recommendations. We're working with partners to define desired public benefit outcomes that are unique to local communities, with an emphasis on both revenue, as mentioned, and with beneficial vertical infrastructure builds. And importantly, the partners around the table working together and with others are trying to identify new mechanisms for financing this and funding it, braiding a range of different resource sources. And then we're also working again with the Gardner Policy Institute to generate public policy recommendations, to take an objective and transparent look at this with all of you, and to integrate some frameworks that we know we want to work with, which include social determinants of health issues that we'll talk about, regional planning that's existing, smart growth, and also really importantly now, recovery from the pandemic, both in economic and healthcare terms. We want to do it in the Utah way. Again, really transparent, goodwill, emphasize local needs. Quick word on asset mapping and valuation. And this is the most difficult part, I think, of this kind of project for some landowners. Not for all, but for some, where they've got really complicated issues going on. And again, they don't really know what they own or how to value it. So different entities have been doing this across the state. We want to understand what's been done there and help support this kind of mapping and valuation. Want to reference, again, Urban 3. That has done some of this work as they presented at the convention last year with Salt Lake County to map some of the assets in Salt Lake County. These are just some of the slides from their presentation. Urban 3 also, to give credit where credit's due, worked originally, I think, first in Utah with the city of Ogden. You see here the tremendous impact that this early study from a couple of years ago now found at a very high level within Salt Lake County. Total market value per the assessor of all publicly owned land, $150 billion portfolio. Total market value of all publicly owned land that was deemed at a very rudimentary but expert level at that time for development, 10 billion. So a big numbers here that we need to really be careful about and think together about how we manage this, which is what we're doing now. Some slides that Urban 3 showed last year and that we've shown a lot across the state in different scenarios. These are just projections of what you could do with publicly owned land. You can see some of these numbers start really popping some eyes open, as they did for all of us. This is a county complex case study, theoretical. And I know that the county has, I think, retained Urban 3 to do a deeper dive into their property, Fleet Block in Salt Lake City. And this one, which they show, they always gets a lot of eyes opened wide, which is West High in Salt Lake City. What could be done there with leaving the high school completely intact? There are existing frameworks for public asset development in Utah that are nationally recognized. Two of them in particular often come up in conversations. One is SITLA, of course, and the other is the Business Depot Ogden, which is an innovative ground lease between Ogden City and one of our developers here that's created some substantial revenue that serves a couple of different entities there. Those are case studies that we'll be looking at too as we go forward, but we want to also think about what other outcomes we might generate from this kind of work. One of the priorities, again, that we're looking at in this type of work is creating new public revenue streams. We're making the assumption, which we'll vet, that public asset development that doesn't prioritize new public revenue yield at worst is just not sustainable, and at best is really short-sighted. So we want to do have an emphasis on generating that revenue and get other benefits from it. One of the frameworks that we're really prioritizing is the social determinants of health framework, healthy communities. We're seeing a strong tie, as mentioned, between public asset development and the health of a community. How is a community building its infrastructure and using its assets? And what level of health do they have in a variety of ways? Those things are linked. And so we want to forge greater ties between that link. And I'll let Nick talk about that quite a bit as we go forward. We want to address multiple social determinants of health in every project. We're making the assumption that public asset development projects that target just one determinant, for example, just housing, are a little bit short-sighted, or sometimes very short-sighted even. So ideally, we're looking to support projects that could address two or more, or all, in some cases, of the social determinants of health. And we've listed here some of the most common drivers in public asset development where you get a lot of partners around the table to help finance and plan those projects. Accordingly, we're also supporting a range of vertical infrastructure strategies. Common ones listed there on the left. Also just pointing out that from a healthcare perspective, mixed use developments are quote unquote scientifically supported by the healthcare sector to help improve outcomes in communities. So a priority. We want to prioritize and support existing sustainable growth and economic recovery initiatives. There's also a strong correlation that we want to support and promote between social determinants of health and existing quality growth initiatives in this state that are integrating public transportation, housing, and land use planning. Many public asset development opportunities there, and a lot of things that Utah has already done that other states don't have to build on. And we also want to support communities as they seek to meet recent legislative requirements and make use of legislative incentives and opportunities for public asset development projects related to transportation, housing, and rural workforce services and economic development in particular. So where there's an existing initiative in your community or your region, we want to support that and not recreate the wheel. We also want to make really strong connections again between social determinants of health and the regional planning that's going on all across the state. And I throw up this slide just to show you that some of the priorities, if not all of them, in the social determinants of health framework are the same priorities that you see in those regional plans. There is a direct overlap there. So we're talking about the same thing. And what we want to do is bring resources from these different sectors together. So together, again, with organizations in Utah representing your community banking, healthcare, and philanthropy, including corporate, institutional, and private philanthropy, we're working together with public entities to support a range of things in terms of partnership structures, again, that help meet the needs of your particular community, whatever it may be. And there's a broad range of things we can do within the frameworks that we're using. You see some of them here. I want to especially down at the bottom there, point out we are looking at joint use of private land or private landowners that can complement this effort. And we're also looking at racial and minority equity, opportunity, and governance overlays that are really critical, especially right now. And again, COVID relief efforts. I'm going to go back to here to say we're trying to put together models that are new, that are responsive to local needs, but that are also replicable. So we're going to try to document in what we're doing how other communities that have similar characteristics can do it and build it uniquely for their communities too. Financial partnerships, we're looking at pairing bank financing and investment in combination with a range of things, public land being the big one. That's a game changer. And a range of other resources from partner institutions in the private sector and nonprofit sector. So all of these types of things you see here. And again, generating replicable models. Go down to the bottom again to point out that we're emphasizing real estate partnerships with the private sector and nonprofit sector for co-development, land donation, land swaps, joint use agreements, and that we're also prioritizing long-term or revolving and ongoing versus one-time support. We're trying to build responsive solutions for communities in the short, medium, and long term. We've put together over the last year or so a couple of demonstration projects and case studies at all different levels of development. Some of them are just very early conversations. Some of them are projects that are have gone out to RFP, and there's a developer on board, and a lot of them in the middle. They're statewide. They're representing urban, suburban, rural, resort, and tourist destination communities. No project is too big or too small for us to take a look at and try to think about. We are working with a range of different landowners, cities, counties, higher education institutions, school districts, transportation authorities, nonprofits, and nonprofit and commercial partnerships. And I really want to thank some of the partners that we have had here in these demonstration projects, which include Salt Lake Community College, Salt Lake City, looking at a range of different interesting things, Ogden and UTA with the Ogden Bus Rapid Transit Line, Park City School District and Park City, looking at the Park City School District Master Plan and the Park City Arts and Culture District, Green River and the organization Epicenter, looking at housing in Green River, and Moab, looking at some of their projects with us, and a couple of others too. You can see there, I've mentioned some of these case studies. They cover everything, large scale, small scale. People are looking at their entire portfolios. Sometimes they're looking at one small parcel. They're looking at multiple parcels that are contiguous and non-contiguous. Sometimes they're pairing up with another landowner to get multi-jurisdictional effort projects going on. And in some cases, we're looking at private land. I want to flag there, and Nick can maybe talk about this to the extent he's comfortable, down in St. George, looking at how Intermountain might look at some of its holdings down there and kind of come at it from the reverse. So if there's, again, complementary private or nonprofit held land, how can we work with the community to make use of that land? The goals for these case study projects cover the gamut, as I mentioned, but they're all within the framework of social determinants of health and quality growth and regional planning. I've highlighted in blue there the commonalities between them. I think all of them include housing to some degree. And again, we want to really promote housing in context of other community needs. And all of them are thinking about revenue generation to some degree. And then they vary widely. To help get this right and think about it in a smart way, or a smarter way, and with all of you, we've engaged as a partnership, the KMC Gardner Policy Institute, to help undertake a scope to take a look at this issue. You can see what their scope is there. They'll be conducting research starting this month, running through April. That will help inform the public about best practices around public asset development, what you should all consider if you're thinking about this, how you should think about it, what types of partnerships are right, and also how you should think about the link between what you might do and, again, the social determinants of health framework. And we also want to help all of you and all of us think about partnerships that might be available to you to help finance and fund this, and what ones make the most sense for you and your potential partners. And then on the right, you see kind of their deliverables there, what they'll be putting out for public review and engagement, national literature review, so we all are on the same page about what the experts say. They'll be looking at the inventory of leverage assets in Utah that exists already, who's inventoried their assets and to what degree and how has that gone. We'll look at some case studies there too. They'll look at public asset projects that have been completed already. And then they'll be analyzing and documenting and tracking and helping us all think about those case studies and demonstration projects that we mentioned. That's the overview. We want to stop and ask for your questions, corrections, if we've gotten our facts wrong, even at this early stage, what your concerns are. We've heard a lot of concerns that fall into a couple of main categories that we think we can address, and also a lot of ideas, and we need to hear more of them. We want to know what you want us to know and how we can help you, and we want to keep this conversation going through the next couple of months as we work with the Gardner Policy Institute. And I think with that, I'm going to let Nick, my colleague from Intermountain Healthcare, say a few things about the social determinants of health framework, and why Intermountain's so interested in this, and then let my colleagues at Zions Public Finance and Gardner Policy Institute say a couple of things that they might like to share out the gate.
Hi, Shaleane. Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Shaleane, you did a great job. I'd just like to take a minute to talk about Intermountain's interest in all of this. So as many of you may know, increasingly, Intermountain is thinking about what our role is in helping to build healthy communities. It's part of our kind of upstream efforts to address the social determinants of health throughout the state of Utah. The reason that we're engaged in that is, we know that the built environment where people live and their behaviors really drive health outcomes. We know that 60% or more of people's health outcomes are resultant from those couple of factors. Really, only a very small portion is a result of actual medical care. So we have a variety of initiatives to think about, to do exactly that, to try to address the social determinants of health and help people to live their healthiest lives possible. And we really like this public assets development concept because we see that there's a ton of potential to do exactly this, right? To address the social determinants of health. As we've been out speaking with leaders throughout the state, as Shaleane pointed out, it strikes me that the priorities in most cities and counties are aligned with the social determinants of health in some way, as are a whole bunch of other kind of regional planning initiatives. So we really see that there's a ton of potential in this public assets development concept, if it's done in sort of the right way, quote unquote, as Shaleane has laid out here, to address those social determinants of health and really to end up with a much healthier population. To put a little bit of a finer point on this, our role in this is potentially many. Right now, we've helped to fund some of this research, and we are participating in many of the example projects that Shaleane laid out. We are at the table, kind of thinking about what our role is. The most immediate answer is potentially some of our impact investing work. So we have rolled out this impact investing initiative over the last few years, or over the last year or so, that seeks to provide loans and other types of investments to projects that are aligned with the social determinants of health. I think our involvement is potentially much bigger, though. Shaleane mentioned a couple of things, particularly land swaps, co-development. I think we are kind of at the table and willing to and ready to explore what our best role is. Shaleane alluded to a project that we've just initiated in St. George, where we're kind of doing a very similar concept, but with our own privately held land. So, we recognize that we have an inventory of land assets, some of which we sort of deem as surplus. So the question we're asking ourselves is, well, how can we best develop those to meet community needs? So maybe some of you are on the call this morning, but we just started a process down in St. George to think about how we do this exact same thing for our own privately held land. I think that's all I have to share there. Shaleane, did I miss anything? Anything you'd like me to specifically address?
No, I don't think so. One thing I wanted to point out is that there's, again, a lot of ways to come at this in a particular community. So some communities are, we've approached them or they've approached us about a specific parcel of land. Sometimes it's about the entire portfolio. Sometimes it's about the needs of the community. And there's not a thought yet about land use or specific parcels, but there's a known problem or opportunity that they want to realize, and we're helping them to think about how land use and public asset development and perhaps complementary privately held land development could contribute to the solution. So there's no right way or wrong way to come at this, and we're all kind of learning it together, which is part of the point of this year and next year as we go forward with the Gardner Policy Institute. And maybe my colleagues there want to jump in or say hello, or what they're hoping to help us do during the next couple of months.
Well, thanks, Shaleane. I'll take a minute here and I'll jump in on behalf of the Institute. We're excited about this project for a couple of reasons, and one of those reasons is that our guiding principle is to ask really good questions. So we're going to be going through this process with that in mind, to ask the questions that we need to ask about this, and about the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why of how this could help local communities to look at their public assets. So there's a few things that we'll be doing in that direction, trying to ask those appropriate questions and then help local communities ask those questions as well, and be there to help with that guidance as well. The social determinants of health is a really nice framework for this, and as I study economic development plans around the state, I constantly see quality of life as one of the goals for those plans, and that's something that all communities are interested in and promoting with their residents and their citizens, is how do we achieve a greater quality of life? And those social determinants of health, those are a nice framework for us to start asking some of those questions, and ask the questions about how these public assets can come into play there and increase the quality of life for all of our communities. So we're excited to be part of this project, and excited to get some questions from these communities and find the best ways that we can be helpful. So thank you to everyone for inviting us to be involved.
Thank you. And Jonathan, my colleague at Zion's Public Finance, I'll nod to you by saying another priority for all of us is that we do not want to get, again, ahead of what's the best thing to do in local communities, and also what makes the most sense for these public landowners financially and otherwise. And so we're trying to be really careful about deferring and understanding what makes the best financial practice, and what needs to be considered financially and otherwise when we start talking about use of public land. So maybe you can say something to that effect, or give us your perspective on how Zion's Public Finance and your peers and colleagues are approaching this.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Shaleane. We don't want to run too fast. We don't want to trip over ourselves as we go through this planning process and coordinating process. There are financial ramifications potentially. There are smart ways to do the financing specifically, and our group obviously does a lot of that with cities throughout the state, providing advice on how to structure this in a way that makes financial sense. We also, through our municipal consulting group, can help plan projects, evaluate projects, market impacts, and highest and best use for the municipalities throughout the state, so that these assets can be better utilized for the long term. I loved how you suggested in the presentation here that we're not looking for the short-term fix. It's got to be a sustainable long-term solution that actually produces some benefit from a revenue or financial standpoint to the communities that participate here. And it can be a win-win-win on all sides, from private sector, public sector, nonprofits, et cetera. And that's what we'll be here to help do.
Thank you. And the final thing I would say before we go to some questions or comment is what the role of Zion's Bank is. We want to see this kind of work happen in Utah. We think it's very promising. We want to see it happen in the right way. We also see ourselves as bringing people to the table. We want to be on board, and we also want lots of other banking institutions and other financial institutions and other partners who can help finance and fund these things to come on board. And so I think, and I know Nick feels the same. In a lot of the case studies and demonstration projects, we're helping to steward them along, and we want to see them work whether we're in the mix financially or not, because we think this is so significant to Utah. So Zion's Bank sees this as sees itself as a community anchor for this kind of effort in a variety of ways. And so just want to emphasize, we want lots of people coming to the table to help make this type of project work.
And Shaleane, just a note, you've got a couple of questions coming in through the chat. I don't know if you're able to view that while you're presenting. But one question is, it's noted that there are several religious organizations that may own a lot of property, both developed and undeveloped throughout the state. Any thought about including those groups in these discussions?
Yes, I think we want to say again, to my last point, we would like to see many partners come to the table. And so we're looking at starting this work with some, again, what we're calling anchor organizations representing, as I mentioned, banking, healthcare, philanthropy, education and public policy. But where there are other anchor organizations of any type that have expertise, land holdings, interest in the outcomes, interest in seeing some of these things in communities work, we'd like to bring them to the table. And some of them already are a range of different organizations that make sense to be in different communities and thinking about helping specific communities. I can see some of the questions. I see one from Senator Anderegg. So thank you for being with us, Senator Anderegg. And he is saying you may need to look into adjusting the code for dealing with surplus property attained through eminent domain. I believe there is a first right of refusal requirement that must be addressed. One of the things that we know is that we do need to look at a range of different issues in relation to a range of different types of land and types of parcels and types of projects. And so that's one of the main reasons that we wanted to get to some of these demonstration projects and case studies. They're also different, but they're also applicable to some of the things that are common across Utah that we think through some of the case studies, we'll get to some of these questions. And they are, again, about what local communities need, how they're defining needs, how they understand their real estate, what they'd like to see, what are some of the legal, financial, regulatory hurdles and obstacles and opportunities. Where do we need, as Senator Anderegg suggests, to tweak some things and in order to get the outcomes that you want? And is that a smart thing to do? Some of these things are all going to be addressed through a lot of the case studies and demonstration projects that we're looking at. And again, in a transparent way and a publicly informed way with the Gardner Policy Institute.
While we're waiting for some additional questions, I was wondering if you have any advice for any maybe smaller mid-sized cities who are interested in doing asset inventories, but are concerned about the potential cost. They might not have the staff capacity to go out and look at these, and they might not have the GIS systems. I was wondering if you had any advice for them or what they could expect that cost to look like.
That's something that's come up often, and it came up quite a bit last year when we were having these conversations during the LEAP convention. I think one of the things that we want to do is take a look together over the next couple of months what the needs are there for asset inventory and valuation in rural communities across Utah in particular, and how we can meet some of those needs. I've heard a range of different things. Sometimes the land holdings are smaller, so it's not quite as involved. Sometimes they're a lot larger, and it's also more involved than you might even see in a large urban area. There's been talk about consortiums of landowners in rural areas coming together to do this collectively. And so I think there's a range of things that we need to know better and understand better in order to answer that question. I think one of the things we do then want to look at together as partners is how we can provide as a state or as private sector partners or as public entities some resources to get that kind of work done. And then I think we also want to connect that asset inventorying and evaluation in rural communities with some of the, again, planning initiatives that are going on there, and make sure that those are linked. So a range of things to think about. We don't yet know what we don't know about those needs, but we know that rural communities are a priority for every single one of the partners. And so we need lots of mutual knowledge exchange there in order to figure that out. Nick and Mac, maybe you can talk about too your different thoughts or how you see priorities for rural communities fitting into this kind of scenario.
Shaleane, I think one of the priorities is communication. As you mentioned, there has to be an exchange of information there. And part of that just has to do with understanding what's already happening at the state level and what resources are available and who is working on this so that that coordination can take place. So one example that you pulled up in the presentation was the Coal Country Strike Team. You know, we've helped with that initiative, and that's been really beneficial from a communication standpoint. Just having that exchange of information to discuss those issues in a comprehensive way has been really helpful. And through that process, we've been able to pull in partners from the state or the Salt Lake area or whoever it might be to come down and focus on specific projects in that area. So that, I think there has to be some communication that goes on, and I think there needs to be an investment in that communication infrastructure as one of the first priorities for this to be able to move forward.
Well, and also, you know, for Intermountain's part, both for our impact investing work, but really for our social determinant of health work broadly, rural communities are a priority, and in some ways they are kind of a nut that remains uncracked, particularly on the impact investing side. So, you know, I think all I would say is that we love to help drive project development to the degree possible, or you know, we would love to participate in kind of rural-based projects and are eager to find ways to do that. So would love to deepen that conversation.
I will say too, you know, you've seen it all throughout the presentation. The one foundational principle that we're promoting is that unless you know what you own and where it's at and what the value of it is in a variety of different ways, and who else owns land around you or within your boundaries or jurisdictions, then the decisions that you might make about public asset development are probably not as informed as they could be. And also, you're not going to probably realize as many outcomes as you could if you had that bigger picture. And so I'm going to nod to Senator Anderegg too, since he asked the first question, to, you know, we're also really trying to prioritize helping communities meet legislative mandates and incentives for housing and transportation and regional planning. And so could we take a look at supporting this type of work in a variety of ways through those existing lenses as a key factor in making those initiatives a success?
It looks like we've got two more questions come in. First, from Lon Crow, I can't see the rest of the name. In a PPP/joint development, would a private property be assessed separately to allow a city to leverage urban renewal? Risk would be a concern for municipal governments.
Yes, 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 and yes is what I would say to that. So again, that's that question in particular, and a lot of the attendant concerns, but also ideas that have come up around this question, is one of the primary reasons we wanted to get to some interesting demo projects and case studies where some of these questions and potential scenarios are coming up. But there are ways to think about different assessments within a specific project or development area to hit those objectives in particular and to mitigate risk. But also we want to think very carefully, as Jonathan and we've all talked about, what that risk is and know what it is and think about how to mitigate it and address it. So hopefully some of these questions will become manifest and we'll get some answers around specific projects, again, that we can start modeling out and thinking about. And if you're in a community and you have a specific idea or a project that you'd like to help have a look at, then we'd be interested in talking to you there too.
And then next question from Ted Knowlton. In some or many cases, the land use regulation affecting these parcels doesn't fit with what the land might or could become. How and when should local governments be brought into the conversation?
My top level and summary answer to that is we want local governments there at the very beginning, right? So as you've seen throughout the presentation, we're assuming that we are trying to help local communities understand what their potential is with their assets and use and realize that potential in ways that make sense to them. And so even within the frameworks that we've outlined here that are helpful to us in thinking about this effort, we're really promoting them because we think they're helpful to local communities. So this is not a situation, Nick and I talk about this a lot when we're talking with different landowner partners, where they're often asking, what are your specific requirements or objectives for this project? And we often say, well, they're whatever yours are in your local community. And that can get a little bit ambiguous, and we feel sometimes a little bit bad about it, but we mean it very sincerely. Like, we are trying to help local communities and local governments make the best use of their assets for their community in ways that make sense to them. And that is a top priority. So from the very beginning.
Yeah, just from Intermountain's perspective, and I think from Zion's as well, our goal isn't to exert our priorities or our will on these projects, right? Our goal is to prop up the model and to really develop this idea of public asset development, because we both are committed to the potential of it to address social determinants of health and really to influence the built environment in a really positive way.
Another thing I would say about that is, where it's the case that there's, as there are, disagreements or different views about land use or jurisdictional conversations, we think these frameworks and this kind of conversation can actually help solve those. So if we're looking at what's important to local communities very broadly and how we can hit a range of positive outcomes, not just one, in a local community, we can usually, I think, find our way to a solution that's better for those local communities, even in the case where there's some existing points of difference in land use. Let's put it that way. So we want to think about those hard questions within these frameworks and within this effort as well.
Thanks for that. And I think that highlights the need for these sort of long range, general plans and regional plans, and being able to kind of have communities outline what their desires are, what their objectives are from the get-go. And then it looks like we have another question from Steve Mumford. Many elected officials don't believe that public agencies should compete with the private sector. Are there limits to the recommendation for the types of projects that meet the desired outcomes, but don't necessarily compete with the private sector?
Yeah, this is one that has come up from the beginning as well. So this concern about competition with the private sector. And we've thought about it in a couple of different ways. It's also, I'm happy to see these questions because they are the top questions leading us to think about, we need help from Gardner Policy Institute to kind of walk through these in a really responsible way. But this is one that's come up from the very beginning. At a high level, I'd say, yes, we want to make recommendations for limits in that sense, but we also want to make recommendations for opening up perceived limits where there's a potential for the private sector and the public sector to work together for mutual benefit, including mutual financial benefit that's really emphasizing public revenue and public good. And there's not competition, but there's a way to collaborate. So again, we want to hit some of those hard questions and hard examples and navigate our way through them. But that's one of the top concerns that's come up, but it's also one of the top concerns that's generated a lot of positive conversation and ideas. I think the time is right to kind of put some of those navigational lines out there where we can recognize mutual benefit across different sectors for the public good.
Shaleane, could I add that that's exactly what this is about?
Yeah.
You know, the public asset development is about partnerships with private sector and avoiding or eliminating that competition. It might be that there are public assets that are better used for the private sector and legally can be used and financially are usable and beneficial to the public entities and the private enterprise. That's the whole point of this, is to try to eliminate the barriers and bring people together, which I really support and think this is a great use for governments to think through different options.
And I would add that I think the housing challenge is unique in that it's a kind of a conglomeration of so many different problems that have all kind of manifested in what we might refer to as housing affordability. And I think it takes a wide group of stakeholders to really address the underlying problems. And I think that is why the public-private partnerships here are so important.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that issue in particular. Housing is at the fore of our thought here. And that's not a contradiction to what I said previously in the presentation, that we don't want to think about housing as a single driver in a project. We want to think about housing broadly and comprehensively within a constellation of needs and solutions that make sense to local communities. And so we're very cognizant, and I think as we go forward in this conversation, you'll see some of the thinking why we're making the assumption that addressing one determinant of health, housing being one of them, in isolation alone in a project is not as advisable as doing it another way. But if you do it another way, you could hit a range of outcomes. We do want to incentivize and support those public landowners that are thinking about housing in their communities. And of course, we want to support SB 34 requirements and plans and ideas and strategies, and really make that productive in a way that has benefits, including housing, but well beyond housing as well.
And it looks like we have another question from Carrie. It's not showing me your last name, so I apologize. You've talked about pilot projects as the way to answer many of these questions. Do you have any plans for those in the next year or two, and where are they?
Yes, I'm going to go back here, and that's Carrie. Hi, Carrie. It's nice to see you here. I've outlined here some of where they're located in the state and kind of the principles there. We wanted to get a lot of different communities with very different but representative needs, land issues, concerns, desired outcomes, questions, politics, community relations, and all of the rest. And so I mentioned what some of those are. Those are the areas in the state, and again, a wide range but representative. And you'll be seeing those, and we'll be discussing them publicly as part of the Gardner Institute scope within the next 6 months, to answer the timing question.
I think it's fantastic that there's already a number of these projects underway where you can kind of see how it's working on the ground in Utah and see some of these best practices start to emerge, or see some of the obstacles. It's always more difficult to actually start talking in details and when these become real rather than just sort of the hypothetical. So it's exciting to see that some of these are moving forward, and there's an opportunity to learn from them for other communities.
Yeah, and I will say too, the case studies, they're real. So, and they're all at different stages. And so by real, we mean some of them aren't moving forward yet. Some of them are ideas in development. Some of them are kind of midway from the idea stage to the implementation stage. Some of them have gone through an RFI, an RFP, and a developer procurement process, and different levels of approval at the state. And some of them are coming at this, again, just to repeat, from the perspective of a land parcel or a community problem or a range of different things. And so we've tried to, in the case studies, not just think about the specific project, but how communities and different people and landowners get there. We're not sure all of them will work, and we want to document that too and understand why.
Terrific. Well, looks like we're brushing up against 3 o'clock. Shaleane, do you or any of your colleagues have any final thoughts you'd like to share for our attendees?
No, just other than what we've said, and to kind of go back to some of the first principles guiding this, we think there's a lot of tremendous opportunity here and a lot of need, but we also think there's a lot of risk and concern that we need to think about together as a community. And so that's why we are approaching it in the way that we are. I'd emphasize we want to help understand the needs of local communities and put them in context, the frameworks that we're looking at. And I'd also emphasize that we want to bring lots of different partners to the table to think about how these projects can make financial sense. For some of the private sector partners and the anchor organizations thinking about financing, public land in the mix that's retained, the ownership is retained, is a game changer in thinking about how you generate some of the financial models. So that's to a large extent what is different here. And we are very appreciative of landowners and entities that are willing to work with us and think about using their land in this specific way.
Thank you. Well, and let's see. Looks like that's about time. So I want to thank all of our panelists again for taking the time to share this with us today. I'm glad we were able to reschedule it from annual, and I think it's been a really productive conversation. Thank you to all of our attendees who've taken time out of their day to learn about this. On a sort of final note, is there a good, there's the contact information.
There's my contact information.
So yeah, I'd encourage anybody to reach out to Shaleane if they have any questions or if they're interested in participating. Let us know at the League if you have any questions or you'd like to learn more about any of these issues. We're always happy to talk with you and understand where you're coming from. So once again, thank you everybody for taking the time to discuss this today, and I think that about wraps us up.